Welcome everybody. My name is Emmy Mandelman, and my role today is to give you a quick introduction on about the place. So a safety induction, just in case there is a fire. We've got two exits out here, and there's the exit there, and of course there is the sound of the siren that will occur just in case there is an emergency. We will all be led by a number of our people here that are familiar with the place, your hosts, and we will assemble at the assembly place, which is towards the bottom of our road there on the side, just before you turn towards the power plant. So again, welcome everybody, and welcome Alban, who will now take over the proceedings.
Well, thank you, Emmy. It is my pleasure to be chair of this morning's seminar. It takes me back a few years to the Friday morning seminars of those many years. And it certainly gives me pleasure to welcome so many people, indeed people from those other years here. A pretty argumentative lot, so maybe that'll occur this morning. One thing I need to do. Good morning, Rao. Rao has joined us from India, and I will mention T.C. Rao in a moment. Good morning, Rao. It would have been in early 1962 that a project on the simulation of a ball mill classifier circuit was started up at the university. The three involved were David, T.C. Rao and me. David's task was to work out the breakage function, to get a good understanding of that. Rao's was to work out the classifier model, so out of that came the cyclone model. Mine was to understand how plants operated and collect data on how plants operated. David made a lot of progress, but after 3 years he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship, went off to Oxford. After 3 years at Oxford, he moved into the mining and finance industry. He sort of moved in and out of both of them. And in recent years, he has been involved very heavily in the heavy mineral sands industry as a consultant, as a manager, and as a very senior executive. I did have some notes, but for some reason I seem to have forgotten. David's grandfather was Premier of Queensland during 1929 to 1932. He led a combined party which was very similar to today's LNP. David started a book on his grandfather's life and his achievements, and he's put that on hold while he completed another PhD thesis, which is kind of historical, part metallurgical, part political, part, no doubt, other matters. It's now been approved by Swinburne University. So it gives me much pleasure to introduce Dr. David Moore.
Alban, ladies and gentlemen, very few ladies in the mining and metallurgy department, and I became number 2 student there's apparently a bit of a debate about this. Phil Bush said that he had his PhD awarded earlier than mine. He's number 6. And I said, as I'll explain later, I finished my thesis earlier, but no one would assess it properly. It's a unique opportunity to be able to reminisce with Alvin. Dr. Rao, hadn't seen you for 50 years. Welcome. Other people who have been associated with the JKMRC, which is, I think, has had a fabulous history, and it's something we want to talk about at the end. However, it gives me an opportunity to prove it can take a mere 50 years and the writing of a second thesis to demonstrate improvement in my style and substance, according to my previous supervisor. The presentation I've entitled From Thesis to Thesis, and it covers aspects of 2 very different PhD theses written in 2 contrasting eras. The first was submitted to the University of Queensland in late 1964, and the second 50 years later through Swinburne University of Technology. These marked bookends of an unusually diverse working career in the minerals industry, and hopefully it demonstrates to you that ultimately you can teach an old dog new tricks. My objective today is to try to bridge a 2-generation gulf and conclude with some macro observations regarding the very unusual challenges facing the Australian mineral industry today. The preparation of the presentation provided a timely opportunity to reread Kennedy's book, The Man from Osaka, The Life and Times of Julius Cushing. How many people in this room have read that book? And could I recommend it to a lot of other people, because it tells you a very interesting story of the dilemma that Julius Cushing had in getting the Mount Isa mines operation off the ground, and whose name, in my view, is very appropriate remembered here. Now, the 1964 thesis, it was in 1957. I was one of the youngest and, I would say, least mature freshers, having just turned 17 and returning to Brisbane after 6 years in New South Wales, during which time I jumped a year. So, due to the curriculum differences, I was a year ahead of people I'd sat beside at Eagle Junction State School. But I was no brighter than they were. It was just one of the ways that the curriculum system worked. And finally, 60 years later, we're getting a uniform national curriculum, if I understand it correctly, in the next couple of years. As I lost some ground, I really was not involved in anything other than catching up and non-academic activities, including possible romantic pursuits, were put on hold. At the end of a successful first year, having a scholarship with BHP, their personnel manager at Newcastle, Steelworks, persuaded me to change my major from chemistry to the relatively new UQ discipline of metallurgy offered within the then small but very critical department of mining and metallurgical engineering. And with progressively improved results over the years, my outside interests broadened, particularly in my honours year, which included introduction to mineral dressing with Rex Bull as the lecturer, statistical maths, and even some scientific German. And to my great surprise at the end, I was awarded a university medal, which to this day I do not believe I deserved. But it was part of Professor Frank White's policy of making sure there were a lot of recipients of scholarships and medals within the department, which looked good on my CV and looked good on his PR approach for the department. Frank White was strongly entrepreneurial, not necessarily highly academic in my view, and scholarships and CVs were the most important way he had of marketing the department. And his major skill was also to attract funds. And without doubt, the greatest achievement was the relationship he built up with Mount Isa Mines. Incidentally, I'm one of the few people that never worked at Mount Isa Mines. I've said over the years that all graduates from here used to have Mount Isa mine stamped somewhere on their anatomy, and I'm one of the few that can demonstrate it's not on mine. And without all that, the Julius Krushnick Centre that we have would never come into existence. Age 21, still not particularly advanced in my emotional career, I would reckon, and no clear picture of what I had to follow. It was easy going for Frank White to say, why don't you enrol for a postgraduate degree? If you don't do a PhD now, famous last words, you'll never do one. And he helped me write the application for the Consolidated Zinc Postgraduate Research Scholarship with him as supervisor. But he quickly delegated this role to Professor Lynch, who at that stage, Alban was at the start of what I regard as an incredible career, culminating in a DSc, AO, presidency of the OSIMM in 1989, and heading JKMRC for 19 years. Now the big problem arose was at our first meeting, Alban highlighted the importance of total commitment I had to have to my research topic, even to the extent of thinking about it while mowing the lawn. Now, I had a bit of a problem with this because I was increasingly involved in outdoor activities, rugby as a referee, treasurer of the University Rugby Club, later secretary of the newly formed Junior Rugby Union, and I had a growing interest in economics and politics. Alban may not have known that in 1961 I also enrolled for Economics 1 and Economic Statistics 1. And of course there was a developing relationship with my grandfather, who for 26 years represented a country party seat in the Darling Downs. And he is a rare entity in the fact that he helped found, lead, and then lead into oblivion the country Progressive National Party between 1925 and 1936. And the big issue that occurred at his time as Premier was the Great Depression. And at that time, mining history was starting to become more popular. Remember Geoffrey Blaney's books, the first one, The Peaks of Lyell, Mines and Spinifex, The Rush Never Ended. And I was a devotee of them. I bought originals of those books immediately they came out. Now, back to my thesis, a mathematical analysis of mineral breakage. This is there, the first two theses. The one on the left is the original one here, eaten by the cockroaches on the left-hand side on the library floor. And that's the larger one, handwritten, 2 fingers, just recently was at Swinburne. And this was the mathematical analysis of mineral breakage. The essence of the thesis was to determine whether comminution could be satisfactorily expressed in mathematical terms using stacked matrices, and the technique for examining the required irradiation of carefully prepared size fractions drawn from a constant parent distribution, and then tracking them during the comminution process. The project involved my having to study a high level of maths, because I'd never heard of a matrix at the beginning, become conversant with the measurement of radioactivity using gamma ray techniques, and to convert these to a mathematical matrix and then analyse them on the most beautiful new investment of the University of Queensland. Its brand new Sol computer, which had a building on its own in the centre part of the campus. To understand the irradiation process required my spending time at the Australian Atomic Energy Commission at Lucas Heights, then on the distant outskirts of Sydney. And for 6 months in 1962, home was a hotel room in Gymea, with costs met through a grant from the Australian Institute of Nuclear Science and Engineering. But this provided me with a unique experience. I was an outsider working inside a structured, successful research environment. And it totally convinced me that research was not to be my long-term career. I didn't tell Alvin that at the time, but maybe my behaviour pattern showed that. But I had to persevere for another 2 years to complete that, the work that I'd started. But it only reinforced my involvement in non-research activities. Fortunately, help in this task came from a totally unplanned source, the choice of a pure mineral to use in the comminution experiments. The prerequisite had to be production of an isotope with a reasonable half-life, a detectable gamma ray, without interference from other radioactive isotopes, from elements within the mineral that we were using. And the final choice lay between albite, a sodium-rich feldspar, varieties and magnetite. And as albite had been successfully used by several other researchers in the US, I wisely chose it. Big disadvantage was it only had a 15-hour half-life. So counting had to be completed within 4 days, effectively. Otherwise, the experiment just went to decay away. You couldn't rewind it and start it again. And so that became the discipline that kept me throughout the whole thesis program. And that proved to be an inspired decision because of the external constraint placed on me. After being irradiated in Sydney, the little lead canister carrying the albite was freighted by TIA, Brisbane Airport, where I greeted the last flight, 10:30 at night, taken to the empty St George's, George Street University where we were, where QUT now is. I added it to the parent size distribution, ground it, dried it, ready for me to go home. 7 hours later, I was back in, counting the particle. I'd already lost one half-life before I started doing any of the counting. If a different isotope had been chosen, such as barium-131, which I was really looking forward to using, with a 13-day half-life and more complex gamma ray emissions, the pressure would never have been on me. And to quote Professor Lynch in one of his favourable biological discussions he has of some of the students, he recently wrote, David Moore was a UQ BSc graduate in science whose research schedule had to fit in with his growing interest in rugby union and politics. It is fortunate that a 15-hour half-life radioisotope was chosen for his work, so particles had to be broken as soon as possible after irradiation, otherwise the experiment would have disappeared. He believed that longer half-lives would not have given such urgent attention, other interests would have intervened, and he may never have finished his research. In other words, I could still be a candidate here 50 years later. Apart from my supervisor's understandable concern at my level of commitment, the other issue was to learn how to use the university's new computer. Talking to Bill Wyden this morning, the GE225 computer capacity housed in something as big as a house is far less than an iPhone 6. So we had to then, no off-the-shelf software, no microchips. We first had to understand what a computer was. I can remember Alvin saying, and we are going to use a computer. After all, we only had those electric facet machines for calculations. And had to have our own machine language. We had to prepare the punch cards, which always got stuck in the reader, and the huge output. It was an absolute learning curve. And I'll show you that was one of the things I drew up. I don't even quite know what it means now, but we had to produce, you notice all these superscripts and subscripts and things like that, which drove the typist for the thesis. Nightmare. But that's the sort of, and that's taken from the thesis to show what it was that I was trying to do with the research. And then Professor White intervened again in my career. He said one morning, young Moore, would you be interested in applying for a Rhodes Scholarship? If so, I will help guide you. Well, Professor White was always hands-on in guiding people, Alvin, as we know. And all I want to say is that I'd not even been a candidate for the Rhodes Scholarship if I hadn't strongly pursued non-academic activities throughout the period that I was mowing the lawn. And I should add at that stage, there were no female applicants allowed for Rhodes Scholarship, which I look back and say, thank goodness, because I've sat on various selection committees and I can tell you that the female candidates interview a lot better than the male candidates. Now, winning this scholarship gave me an opportunity to make a major change in my career path. I left Brisbane for Oxford in July 1964. The thesis was incomplete and some results still had to be processed. And in those days, we travelled to the UK by ship. And much of the time I spent from the Himalaya going round the coast from Sydney to Perth was preparing the final input so I could post it back from Perth to our wonderful computer. After enjoying the first taste of overseas travel, the thesis still hadn't been completed on my arrival, and it didn't remain a priority for long because I found it was one of those rare months in England when it didn't rain in September. So the thesis, I was working at Charles Copeland's house at the time, still wasn't finished when I started. And here was I, a new student, doing politics, which I loved, philosophy, which I had some problems with, economics, which I loved, still incomplete. And so we're not preparing for tutorials on these subjects, and in doing the arts thing, your tutorial consisted of one person with two students, so you couldn't hide. If you hadn't read it or written something out, you couldn't apologise. I had to then work in the evenings on the thesis while they were all down at the local tavern down below, and all I could hear was Father New Lord George being sung while I was still trying to write this wretched last few chapters of the thesis. Now, completion of the thesis was close to a nightmare, particularly finding a suitable person to type it. Look, some of the things, and this woman had not been used to typing anything mathematical. Look, it's got superscripts, subscripts. I can't understand it at all, and so could she. And it was done on 6-part carbon paper. You had no word processes. And if a correction had to be done, you had to go back and correct everything. So it was a nightmare finishing. But I was very happy. The other thing, the graphs there, how excellent, they were ironed on. You got them produced, and that's taken from the thesis. You can see, I'd finished, come back, and I'd have to get an iron to then iron on the thesis. So I did that on the 6 copies. And I was high when I got my £1 bicycle, got back to my college to be greeted by a telegram, very elated, from Frank White saying, "Send back thesis unbound." Now, I'd invested quite a lot in that thesis, and Charles Copeland was arranging to send it back for free from RTZ in England, which would have cost me £50. So I had no intention of unbinding the thesis. So, being polite, I sent back a comment saying, "You're authorised to unbind the document if you're not satisfied with it." And I paid a big price for that. I think we should, please. I don't. His father with a picture of Rowley, and that's. Hello.
Yes, hi. I'm sorry.
It's not your fault. I was just offending. I was just offending Professor White. let me go on. I also found that I offended Albert. I must let this one go. I paid a big price for that because Albert informed me that the 6 copies of the thesis sat on Professor White's desk for a year. And the only people that showed any interest in them were the cockroaches. That's how they get them. And the view I've got is that he was probably really pissed off with me for not doing what he had said, and that was part of the legacy I had to bear. Meanwhile, Professor Lynch, I have to say, was equally not very impressed with the thesis. and I'm now going to read a couple of extracts of letters which I didn't keep for an occasion like this, but I happen to have in a file at home. In 1964, Alban said, "While I consider the first 7 chapters were written before you left Brisbane are very good, I'm altogether disappointed in chapters 8 to 10. This is not because of the ideas in them and the analysis of your results, but I think your explanation is most obscure. It took me 3 days of concentrated effort to follow your reasoning." Actually, I couldn't follow it when I reread the thesis recently. Now we come to the next item. He says, "You must know that you write as you talk, dash, verbose and not concise, dash. That is the manner in which the last 3 chapters are written." Again, it's highlighted. "While I know how fed up one gets with writing a thesis, and we all can identify with that, you chose the wrong 3 chapters, and you have done less than justice to the excellent experimental work and analysis." Lest you think that was a lone occasion when he criticised it, in September 1965, in response to my query about how the thesis assessment was proceeding, he wrote with understanding concern, and in case, because I have to give my authority there, I'm going to show you a copy of the letter that was dated in 1965. The key thing to note is this, towards the bottom. "You no doubt the lesson will be well learnt by now that there is a marked difference." I won't rather listen to this bit.
I think you should go ahead. Don't wait for
Okay, I don't want you to miss this bit round because you may have got better service than I did. No doubt the lesson will be well learnt by now that there's a marked difference between writing a technical report and writing an after-dinner speech to the Young Liberals Association. Imagine how I felt at that stage. It is not much good doing excellent work as you did if you don't present it properly. Anyway, we know Alban is a persistent person. So finally, in the week that I'd finished doing all my exams for PPE, an arts degree in Oxford, he made a further comment in June 1966. 2 of the assessors' reports were enthusiastic. The other was sharply critical, although he recommended acceptance. However, the 3rd man was chosen in desperation, after others had reneged after seeing the mathematical content. I don't blame them for that. Had he criticised the last 3 chapters on the basis of their technical presentation, things may have been a little different. Finally, and for the 3rd and last time, however, I am sure you will not make that mistake again. I just had a sense of relief at that stage. My then wife was expecting our first child. I'd secured a job with RTZ in London, and I would never have tackled the thesis again. So, Alban, I want to publicly confess to you, in front of all of the people that have followed on, that chapters 8 to 10 were poor. But it's a pleasure to report, and I'm sure you'll be so happy about this, that I didn't make the same mistake again in the second thesis 50 years later. I told you at the time I was your first and worst student when it came to commitment, and I still believe that. But you were one of my early mentors, and we have remained good friends, even though we don't always agree. For instance, you were a great supporter of Ben Chifley as Prime Minister because he wanted to nationalise the banks. I disagreed, but I gave you a copy of his biography as a farewell gift, which you still have, I think. Having recently spent considerable time examining the events leading up to, during and after the Great Depression, I still disagree with you. Enough of my first thesis. The interthesis years briefly, I never worked in research. I never worked in a technical metallurgical role. It's always been an analytical, administrative, management, advisory, and finally in writing. My career essentially consisted of 3 years in England in secondary aluminium industry, 6 years in Port Hedland and Perth as finance and administration manager in export iron ore industry, 6 years in Adelaide as CEO of a national finance company, 3 years in Brisbane in mineral sands and industrial minerals as CEO of Consolidated Rutile and Kuchin RZ. And for 23 years after that, I had my own consultancy and did contract work, one of which was to be head of the Tigris joint venture in Western Australia, the integrated titanium pigment project. I held some directorships of some smaller mining companies, and during that period I did some consulting work for you, strategic aspects for JKMRC. Now in 1993 I embarked upon an inaugural publication on zircon. Needing stronger technical input, I contacted a Perth colleague who had started a mineral sands report and had technical and operating skills that I didn't have. Together we established a new company called TZ Minerals International Pty, known as TZMI, in 1994, and this was planned to be primarily a publishing company. But within 2 years we were a joint consulting company with our own database. And our first publication was the Changing the International Outlook for Zircon, which we each spent 60 man days in, got no money for, and barely covered our costs. But we learned a major lesson to pre-sell documents, and our consulting activities grew from there. They've covered things like zircon, forecasting out to 2015, titanium metal, and a lot of work on China. And this is the pigment industry in China, but in the development of the titanium minerals industry, where Australia on the whole had a very strong strategic advantage, both through technology, through equipment, and through the resources we had. I retired from TZMI in November 2009, with my project being to write my grandfather's biography. And I was particularly stimulated by differences between the Great Depression and which is now called the Great Recession, which was the global financial crisis in 2008-9. Now to do this, I did some writing courses and to make my writing style more interesting. And so my second thesis in 2014 emerged through tracking down Professor Brian Costa, who'd been awarded a PhD here from the University of Queensland for his thesis on Queensland and the Great Depression. And this was one of the articles in Queensland Medieval Portraits from 1859 to 1952. Didn't cover all premiers, but those who come in for some special attention. And he and I met. We put an ad in the Courier Mail in 1982 to say, can anyone tell me any more details on A.E. Moore, my grandfather? And I bought him a dinner, a bottle of wine, and then in return he, years later, persuaded me to do a PhD in Swinburne under his patronage. At that stage he was research professor in the School of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. And so by mid-2010, my enrolment for a PhD was final, to be completed part-time in 8 years. And the original title was pretty dull, Arthur Moore and the Non-Labor Parties in Queensland from 1915 to 1941, if anyone wants to read it. But despite having much access to my grandfather's files, and an example of that is, that was the title in that book, Odd Man In. And my grandfather's library had cuttings of his time in the Premier's Department and other things, which I carted around the world with me. So I had some additional information. But my aim was to do the biography. And one element of the biography was going to be his role in what was called the Mangana scandal, which occurred that's a picture of my grandfather in a book, incidentally, that I produced just for local consumption in the Darling Downs to try to track more information. And that was the report on the Royal Commission to inquire in certain matters relating to Mangana Chillago mines came out in 1930. And that was a bombshell report which accused two former premiers of Queensland of corrupt practices in relation to leases at the Mangana mine. So in 2010 I travelled to North Queensland and finally met Dr. Kent Kennedy, author of the Mangana Affair, which is this is his book, State Mining and Political Corruption in the 1920s, who was also the author of the biography of Khrushchev. And the second part of Kent Kennedy's thesis at the James Cook University was on the Mangana Affair. And Kent Kennedy did a wonderful role in recording the mining history of North Queensland. And I found him exceedingly helpful. He gave me information, encouragement, went to Chillago, visited all the major sites in what was quite a remarkable area. And I came to believe that although I'd known a lot about the Mangana scandal from talking to my grandfather, the story should be revisited because there are several myths that have arisen and evolved which immediately get elevated to factual events, which isn't the case. And as the data on Mangana accumulated, it was far too big for a chapter in a biography. So, at my wife's very favourable suggestion, I should change the title of the thesis. And then it was finally adopted in August 2013 on 3 Queensland premiers and the Mangana scandal. Now, enrolment, this is interesting to see the different techniques used 50 years later, Alvin, but enrolment was meant by coming to terms with an entirely new reference and bibliography systems. I had learned to focus on primary sources and not on secondary sources. People say you can get it through Google or Wikipedia. Just be careful. They're not always right. And the tendency is to quote them and re-quote them, and then all of a sudden they're fact. So, you also had to report on your performance during the annual report to be written, and there were 2 presentations to committees of 3. I just want to read out what the chairman of the 2013 committee said about me. Notice the different style. Driven by almost obsessive curiosity, it's not surprising to see David's report on this project at stage 2 as a very clear and detailed outline. This appears to be one of those PhD theses that may actually have something to say. which was a significant improvement, I have to say, on first. So the final 412-page document, which got in the car outside, mostly typed by me with 2 fingers, I completed in August 2014, edited, submitted it, and was advised it was a record for a part-time student, which is not something I've been trying to do. And comments by the two assessors are particularly relevant to this talk. The Professor Geoffrey Bolton, who was Professor of History here, and he'd written a wonderful book on North Queensland called 1,000 Miles Away, and I met him in Western Australia, and he encouraged me to go about this. He said, I approached this thesis wondering whether enough remained to be said about the Mangana Affair to constitute an original contribution to scholarly knowledge. The features worth singling out include the chronological breadth-linking pre-World War I attempts to develop the Chillago-Mangana field, the author's capacity to understand and explain metallurgical factors, which I was quite proud of, and access to reminiscences and papers of my grandfather. The candidate has succeeded in integrating these factors into a completely organised, argued narrative and analysis. The thesis is ably written and presented. Now, Professor Lynch, I want you to note the comment of the second assessor, who, by sheer coincidence, lives next door to you in Solution. His name's Ross Johnson, who's written some other books. And he says the final 3 chapters are effective. Here, it took a long time to learn. Here the candidate shows his strength in making reasonable or plausible explanations, arguments and summaries on 3 topics: the aftermath of the conspiracy trial, re-evaluation pursuant to receipt of recent information, and an examination of the 7 myths that have developed in respect of the story. So, Alvin, it took me 50 years. But I finally did what you wanted me to do. And as a sign of my success, I've got to note this one too, I was awarded a prize from Sydney University. Trust me, I'm a doctor of philosophy, of doctors. Now, both assessors suggested the thesis be shortened, converted to a book, which I'm currently undertaking and will probably do through Bouillon Press, having talked to them yesterday. And I plan to donate a copy of the book to you, Alan, and the book to the JKMRC, if they still have a library at that stage, or to the University of Queensland. That's going to be the next part of it, before I get back and finish writing my grandfather's biography. I'd just like to briefly make a couple of observations on the Chiligo-Mangana story. And I just wonder, how many people in this room have been to Chiligo? Oh, how many have heard of it? About half of the course. You should see what it's like further south. I find Chiligo a fascinating place with its caves, historic smelter site, abandoned railway, and it's had a wonderful part in the evolution of North Queensland political and mining history. It lies inland, 4 hours from Cairns, geographically complex area, in a very narrow Palmerville fault. It was a very poor location for building custom smelters, which were normally built near the sea. And despite the unbridled optimism of the Melbourne entrepreneurs who floated the Chiligo company in 1988, the region was never the oft-quoted another broken hill, which attracted everybody to go there in the first place. The Chiligo company was, at best, a financial dollar. However we define that, it operated for 16 years. It had 4 financial reconstructions in 16 years, which is close to a record. Made profits in only 3 years when prices were temporarily higher. Never paid a dividend. And 4 years later it was purchased by the Queensland government, for which it paid even more price. Although the Chiligo company was floated on the basis of its contained copper, ultimately lead and silver. The silver ores dominated. There was not enough exploration work undertaken to know how about the resources and their complexity. And the only people to know about, to make money from Chiligo were the original entrepreneurs who sold out and shareholders of Mangana Mines Limited, when it was sold to the government on a royalty basis in 1920. And the largest ultimate shareholder in Mangana Mines was none other who received more than $1 million in today's terms, was my grandfather's predecessor as the Premier of Queensland, William McCormack, who, together with Edward Theodore, was ultimately responsible for the foundation of the AWU. Everybody follows Theodore, but no one follows McCormack. In the end, much of the gold and all of the zinc was never recovered, and operations needed at least today's modern mineral separation technologies to be viable. And even then, there's been several attempts to pursue them. Another one just going on now. I think Red Dome was the only company to make any money out of mining in that area. Now, Alvin, in 1905, your predecessor by 84 years, as president of the Australasian Institute of Mining Engineers, his name was Francis Danvers Power. He issued a very damning report about the Chiligo company resources and smelters 4 years earlier. No one took any notice of him. And in his presidential report in 1905, he makes a couple of succinct comments, which I now want to link into today. To be successful, we must have the elements of success: land, capital, labour and ability. Moreover, we must have sufficient of each. Want of money has ruined many an enterprise, as we can all agree with. A likely deposit is no good without the capital to pay for labour and machinery, and ability to manage it. A good mine may be spoilt by being in the hands of incompetent men. I've seen a few of those. A bad mine may be floated successfully because it's in the hands of good businessmen. We've seen quite a lot of those too. But a good mine, under the control of capable men, is what we all desire to see. The flotation of a company does not depend solely on the mine. Many a worthless property has been floated with little or no trouble, while other properties that have eventually turned out well have lain idle for years for want of supporters. In boom time, one can float almost anything. Now, I reckon that's still true 110 years later from what we've seen. So in the final part of the address, I'd like to draw us back onto today in the context of some of the comments I've made and give a macro perception of some of the difficulties that the minerals industry faces. Australia is just one of a handful of very, very fortunate countries which has played and should continue to play a significant leadership role in the global minerals industry. Our rich endowment of virtually all major economic minerals, reflecting a complex geological heritage that evolved over 500 plus million years, means that our wide brown land has an inherent competitive and strategic advantage, which potentially could even be increased if we finally learn how to harness and store solar energy, because we have plenty of solar energy in this country. These factors, however, are offset by the significant disadvantages of being an underpopulated island continent, widespread deserts, often scarce freshwater resources in the right place, distance from many major markets, and our relatively high labour costs. The importance of building upon our net competitive advantage, which seems to receive rare, if any, discussion nowadays, has substantially increased over our lifetime due to the discoveries, exploration discoveries, plus the key elements of demand now coming from the Asia-Pacific region, China, India, Japan, Korea. The once-in-a-century super cycle built around the generally unforeseen dramatic economic rise of China has, however, happened concurrently with the escalating climate change debate directed at reducing the level of carbon emissions associated with the use of fossil fuels. In my working life, I participated in and later witnessed the massive growth of the Pilbara iron ore province with its private railway system, which is the largest private railway system. Before that was the Chillagoe system. In stark contrast to the $10 US per tonne fixed price for 10 years when I entered the industry, the unforeseen explosive growth in demand from China has led to iron ore becoming Australia's largest source of export income, exaggerated by unsustainable price increases. Inevitably, this boom resulted in numerous smaller, lower quality, more complex resources being brought on stream, some of which will almost certainly close or remain closed. It always surprises me how many people fail to believe, or often to remember, the inevitability of cyclical pricing behaviour. When prices are high, there seems to be always the natural propensity to extrapolate their further continuation, ignoring the underlying supply-demand dynamics. Entrepreneurs and financiers jump on the bandwagon during the price upswing, whereas during the price downswing, the focus then comes back on the technocrats to dominate, to try to make the operations more efficient and competitive. And this is precisely the stage we've reached now in Australia. After an unprecedented 24 years, when there's been no downturn in our GDP. But this cannot last forever. There is now a rapidly evolving major challenge to the minerals industry. The increased anti-mining sentiment in Australia as part of the environmental drive for the increased use of renewable energies. We've even seen demands to abandon exports of high-quality coal, as well as totally ignoring its irreplaceable role as a reductant in most primary metallurgical processes. What industries have a similar competitive advantage to the mining sector? And if it was abandoned, what would take their place? You never hear the phrase competitive advantage talked about. And this has resulted in some well-meaning but misled institutions, adopting knee-jerk policies to sell or not become involved in or lend to any mining projects, irrespective of the actual resources being mined. And the height of this ridiculous one occurred with the ANU sending their abandoning investment in Aluka resources. I don't know what that had to do with the coal and debate about carbon. Now, this unique situation poses several challenges to us all, everybody in the mining sector. Research, operating, investment, leaders of the industry. And if we accept that 1905 advice from Francis Andrew Power, updated I have to say to include women when he talks about capable men, that a good mine under the control of capable men is what we desire to see, what are we going to do about ensuring that this philosophy is followed in the future, given today's political and economic climate? It's the slide out on the way, so I'll just go past. Now, I'd like to close with a couple of thoughts for you. We're all part of a diverse industry whose existence is under unusual challenge. Ignore price cycles at your peril. And I'd like to add to that a quote from the late Ian Morgan, another person closely involved with the foundation of the department, its association with Mount Isa and here, taken from the dedication he had to the 1992 biography of Julius Kushner. History not only tells of yesterday's successes and failures, it can be an inspiration to today and a guide to tomorrow. And like the inevitability of cycles, we forget this at our peril. Finally, to round off the presentation, I feel it would be appropriate that we, of the varying years associated with this institution, acknowledge the key roles played in the JKMRC and its link with Mount Isa mines. To Julius Kushner, to Sir George Fisher, Sir James Foots, Ian Morley, Professor Frank White, Professor Alban Lynch, who were all associated with establishment in critical early years. And then later years to John McKee, Tim Nundiamun and Jeff Gold. So in the spirit of today's age, I would like us all to stand. I want to give a virtual toast. We've all brought our virtual glasses. Alvin, you can sit. I'd like to stand in a virtual toast to the JKMRC and its emerging future in this challenging time. And I want to finally say, I'm not going to do any more pieces.
Thank you, David. We did have some rather vigorous discussions in those other years, and very interesting they were. You've opened up quite a scope for discussion. Are there any comments? Yeah.
Yeah, Peter Hayes from the University of Queensland.
Hello, Peter. I haven't seen you for a long time.
With your benefit of your view of the industry and your experience, and you said that Australia is facing these challenges and there's a leadership in the future that this JK can play. So what do you see as the strategy now that the Australian minerals industry should take and people involved in it, particularly JK, the university, do you see a pathway how we can reignite that leadership?
My comment's a macro comment. I'm not close enough on the micro side, but it seems to me that industry has made itself vulnerable because there is no overarching industry philosophy. It's a succession of projects, and as we've seen with Carmichael, and I've seen with other projects, you can pick a project off. So there is no total ethos saying, hey, the importance of mining to the Australian sector, recognising there are some areas where improvement can happen, it is not fully stated. And I don't know if it's ever been fully stated. I can remember Rex Conner producing a document in 1974, which was the contribution of the minerals industry to Australia, which was an alarming document. So it's more of a total view rather than going in and being picked off project by project. And maybe with the changes of ownership and more globalisation of some of the big companies, I'm not picking on BHP or Rio, but they're the big ones, that some of the focus of Australia and the role for us as a country rather than as a component of the contribution of the international companies has been lost. You know, we talked about Mount Isa mines. Now, where are they run from now? And who are running them? It's a very and somewhere look, we have a tremendous number of people, of projects and skills. We're not the biggest coal and exporter and iron ore exporter because we're no good at it, but there is not a cohesiveness about it. And of course education and research all becomes part of that. That may sound a wishy-washy comment, but it's you're calling for something higher up. You know, incidentally, other industries are the same. I want to be very careful how I say this, but we should be very careful that in picking off this and this and this and this to have a look at what the remnants are. What are the remnants? I heard somebody say once that if you want to have a look at Australia 30 years from now, look at New Zealand. That's what they said then. I've got a feeling if you want to look at Australia 30 years from now with all of these things, look at Tasmania, which is non-viable. The political system fails us too, I think. So I don't know whereabouts in the whole industry makeup there is a total of the importance of this industry to the country as a whole. And that's what I mean by competitive advantage.
David referred to Rex Connors. He was a big man. He was the Minister for Mines in Gough Whitlam's government. He was to some degree a visionary, although you certainly wouldn't approve of his vision, but he also would quote poetry. Give me men to match my mountains, you may recall. Yeah?
Oh, well, you're showing your political bias. I remember meeting Rex Conner going up just after the 1972 election, and he had Frank Crean with him, and he was dressed in his. And I said to him, "What are you?" He said, it hasn't changed my preconceived view." Remember also, he was the one who was keen on Ken Martin.
Well, no. We all have our other. Are there any other comments? Yeah.
Yeah, one comment and one question. There are a few of us here who knew Alban a few years after you encountered him for the first time. And so I've seen it. I never realised that. I somehow other thought that Alban developed his sharpness and his attack methods as time went on. I never realised he had it from day one.
He sharpened them on me.
He sharpened them, he should. So that's a tremendous insight to the people who knew Alban, who were his students, which is, and Rao would say this they appreciate those little insights just wonderfully. The question I want to ask you is, which you dodged all the time. You said you didn't have anything to do with research. You didn't really like research. In all your years of experience and your wide range of activities that you've undertaken, what is the useful role of research and research outcomes in this industry? Probably in any industry. And how should it be better applied? Because the problem really, a huge problem is that so much of what is done, good stuff, is very poorly applied or if applied at all.
Well, thank you. If I'd come across as being anti-research, I didn't mean it, but I was anti-me being involved in the research. But in fact, Australia on the whole hasn't been as highly a research-orientated country as some others are. Carol and I recently in Finland, and the amount of money that was being put into certain developing their areas of competitive advantage is substantially greater than happened here. And I think we were fortunate that we were blessed with some very, very good leaders of industry. We talk about not only the people in CRA and who were there, promoters of industry. We've lost a lot of that because we're just part of multinationals. We're just a component of it. And as regards the application of research, I can remember in my mineral sands time coming back to the JK and talking about different ways to look at things. But it's become increasingly difficult to, in today's world where an outcome of 3 years is way too long. That's the electoral cycle, good heavens. You've got to do something by a third of the way the electoral cycle, because then you've only got that middle year and then you're into the cycle again. The demand for instant results totally runs against research. So you've got to be able to find a way of dedicating something to the longer term, as well as dealing with the short-term impulses. And I haven't seen that very well done by many entities, unless they're the ones who've got so much money like the Googles and all of this, where they can adopt long-term policies and pay no dividends. They just dependent on getting their share price up. So I don't have a secret formula.
Yeah.
Michael Young from Glencore Technology. Thank you for your excellent talk, David. Just a couple of comments on what you were just referring to. Certainly, Dr. Bill Johnson and myself were involved in developments at Mount Isa, and when we were developing the Isa technology for Mount Isa Mines, we went through 3 CEOs and 4 general managers in the time that we were developing that. So continuity of management obviously changes all the time. It is very hard to get things done in the long term. And if things occur, it's more normally because of fortuitous circumstances more so than a coherent plan. And I suppose where I've seen things being prosecuted very well in industry is when you have a champion who wants to solve a problem or an issue within a company. And normally the champions who have a large amount of ownership are ones that come from a technical background. So when Julius Krishnet or Foots or Morley or Islington Lewis were in charge of their companies, then they had a vision and they had an understanding of what was going on. Nowadays that doesn't really occur that much. The leaders of the companies are lawyers and accountants, and they don't have the engineering ownership that the rest of us have. But there are champions within the companies at slightly lower levels that can prosecute that and have some vision, even within lots of companies around.
And he gets them promoted.
And well, I suppose it's up to us to target those people with, if we're lower down people, if we have a vision of what needs to happen, to excite those technical people higher up and then they can prosecute it further up the chain within the company. I think that's the way I tend to try to prosecute it within our company, being Glencore.
How orientated are they, the headquarters of Glencore, to research rather than trading?
Oh no, they have no. Their vision is always very short term. I mean, and Glencore currently has a policy that we're not developing any greenfield sites. We'll just be doing expansions of our brownfield sites. Okay, and so the new greenfield sites can be done by other companies. So, but even within that vision, there is lots of room to improve sites. In the current circumstances, there won't be any capital expansions anyway with most companies because the metal prices are down. And so new capital projects aren't going to be happening. What's going to be happening is trying to squeeze more out of what you've got, which is what happens in a lot of the more depressed cycle times.
That's right, on the downside, that's when the focus comes
So
on.
everything's going to go back into productivity. How can we get more out of our current assets? And there are lots of things that the researchers do that can feed into squeezing more out of the current assets as well. I mean, a lot of the work that you gentlemen did with Mount Isa Mines in the early days was, we've got this plant up there, how do we squeeze more out of it and make it more profitable?
I could comment on that. Imagine what would happen if those efficiencies had been in place on the upside. You'd have a bank account to last you over the downside, wouldn't you?
Yes, that's
They tend not to be that way.
No, I know. It's human nature not to.
Volume first.
Yeah.
the issue in a boom is they want to make things happen quickly.
Yeah.
So they take the current known technology and just cut and paste it into, and then once you cut and paste it, then you've got to find out.
If you want an example,
money.
Yeah.
one to follow Fortescue Metals.
Well, I'm from the generation of engineers that lived through that period of shortening of that research timescale from 1987 through, well, it's going on to now. I've got no answers. I'm out in business consulting for myself now, not doing research, which is what I'd love to be doing. I don't have any answers.
Thank you, Dave. Grant Thorne, 1975, I left this fine establishment. Never worked at Mount Isa Mines, but I had a career of nearly 40 years with Rio Tinto. And I'd like just to make a couple of comments, if I may. I have a perspective in quite recent years of how at least one major mining house decides its priorities. And I think it's perhaps some of my comments will be controversial in this setting, but the fact of the matter is that collaborative research could arguably be interpreted as delivery of value to mining house customers. Collaborative research will generally lower the cost curve for a particular metal. It doesn't necessarily put more money in the pockets of mining company shareholders. However, competitive research, the sort where major companies, usually the only ones that can afford it, decide to step apart from the industry, put their hands in their pockets, and usually a long way down, and use big heaps of money to be an early mover, is perhaps where research, and more particularly development, has a role to play in ultimately delivery of shareholder value. But I heard your comments, David, about the extent to which the world now in the resource sector is global, and perhaps national affiliations of major companies has moved on to our detriment. But I take some heart, if only the major miners would actually get back on the pulpit and use the same sort of muscle as was demonstrated when the mining tax was first moved. It took about 10 days for the Australian population to see that actually the people that were running the country were in fact the mining houses, not the federal government. And it was very effective. There was a deluge of media, of advertising, of opinion, that more than held sway with those today who would decry the industry for its environmental impacts. The most outrageous and simple one-line grabs become news and become fact. They're not challenged. Rio Tinto in London is too busy with other things. Glencore in Switzerland is too busy. BHP Billiton, for reasons that I don't quite understand, who still have a corporate headquarters here. You know, they ought to be on their hind legs and baying, and then they ought to be marshalling their fellow companies in resisting what is an inexorable slide to the lack of competitiveness in this country.
Yeah.
And those of us who have had 40 years with the industry, through research, through production, through engagement with communities in ever more sophisticated ways around our mine sites, we are still capable of recovering the situation if only we give it the priority. If we don't speak out for our industry, no one else is going to do it for us. And governments today are so near-focused in priorities, they are incapable of doing the work. Thank you, David. That was fantastic. 50 years.
Thank you, Graham. Yep.
David Sherman from JKYC. I know that there's a lot of changes been taking place. The industry is changing too. The drivers of the industry keep changing as the cycles keep changing. Being a research institute, what kind of skills that we need to impart to our students in addition to just to the technical skills? Because one of the things we also need to sell our ideas, and these things are keep changing. So in your 2 theses and with your experience, what do you think that really we need to do to make sure our students are capable not only doing the technical work, they can also sell their ideas?
You really have to take that one on notice. It's a very good comment. That I've become a believer over the years in having a generalised first few years of university like that. I think they got it in University of WA and they got it in the US, where you can then broaden your skill base before you end up having to make a career decision. Well, in my case, I was in a different career until I managed to go to Oxford. So it's partly in recognising that research is not a closed area, it's a part of a multi-function area. And maybe the whole question of explaining to people what the total mining industry is, rather than just a Mount Isa or a Pilbara or something like that, but it is a collective industry which has actually led to the greatest population explosion in Australia. And we tend to sort of not recognise it, or saying, oh, we've lived off that. That's the thing that disappoints me when people said, oh, get rid of coal. We still want to have our aluminium. We still want to be able to have our added value products and fly to wherever we're going without looking at the consequences. And so I think it's a fairly fundamental line of telling people about an industry rather than the 10-second thing that you see on Foxtel or whatever it is.
I think that it's almost time to have a cup of tea.
There's one more question.
Just to try and summarise, I'd like to go back to my favourite line from your talk, where I'm going to be using this quite a lot as a reference.
Which line?
The one from Alvin Lynch to you, which is what we've been discussing. It's not much good doing excellent work if you can't present it properly. Okay?
To which I have to say touche.
Yeah. So that's what the crux of research is. A lot of people here do excellent work, but presenting it to industry and getting the interest of industry to actually implement the research is the crux of the problem.
Actually, that's a good comment.
We have been seeing row on and off. I should add that Rao was very recently given an award as the Australian University graduate from India who has contributed most to Indian science and technology. So congratulations, Rao. I will now ask alumnus number 4. Yeah.
Careful, Phil Bush might want to beat him.
Dr. Phil Bush.
George Bernard Shaw wrote in Major Barbara, his discussion play on morality, religion and social engineering, he knows nothing and he thinks he knows everything. That points clearly to a political career. To those gathered around the lunch table in the Mining and Met building in George Street in the early 1960s, that quotation would have caused considerable confusion. Here was a graduate student who talked about politics non-stop, but appeared to be reasonably bright. Frank Nicklin was Premier at the time. It was no surprise then that once finished with managerial roles in the mineral industry, David should continue his political interests with a study of a significant 1920s event in Queensland's mining history, which involved his grandfather. David's first thesis was prepared when the university had just taken delivery of its first computer, and we know it well. His second thesis was written in the age of the internet, Google, and mass storage devices. What a change. We have been privileged this morning to travel with David as he has taken us on his life journey from the early days of this institution to the considerable matters which are just as important in our industry today as they were in the 1920s. George Bernard Shaw's statement might be recast, therefore. He knows a lot, and he thinks he has more to learn. That doesn't point to a political career. Would you please join me in thanking David for his most enlightening presentation.
Well, that's complete this morning's seminar.